Open our Bibles tonight, if you will, to the book of John chapter 21. John chapter 21, begin reading with verse 20. John 21:20. Then Peter, turning around, seeth the disciple whom Jesus loved following. Let me put the comma in the wrong place. Then Peter, turning about, seeth the disciple whom Jesus loved following, which also leaned on his, that is Jesus, leaned on his breast at supper, and said, Lord, which is he that betrayeth thee? Peter, seeing him, saith to Jesus, Lord, what shall this man do? Jesus saith unto him, If I will that he tarry till I come, what is that to you, or to thee? Follow thou me. Then went this saying abroad among the brethren, that disciple should not die. Yet Jesus said not unto him, He shall not die, but if I will that he tarry till I come, what is that to thee? This is the disciple which testifieth of these things, and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. And there are also many other things which Jesus did, which if they should be written every one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that should be written. John the Apostle was, without doubt, one of the truly great apostles in the New Testament time. Now, my all-time favorite would still be the Apostle Paul. When I read about Paul and when I think about Paul, I think of all the work that he accomplished, all the churches that he started, and how it was from the Apostle Paul carrying the gospel over into Spain, and then from Spain, the gospel spread under Paul's planting a church in Spain. The gospel spread, and the gospel came to America because Paul the Apostle went to Spain and preached, and from there, the gospel came to us. When I think about Paul, I think about all the suffering that he endured. I think about all the beatings that he endured, the whippings, the stoning, the being left for dead, the times that he went without food and clothes. And then in 2 Corinthians, all the perils that he mentioned, that he faced every day. And every time I read about Paul, I feel like an insignificant, backslidden, cold, hard-hearted person, because I don't have near the zeal or the drive that Paul had. He's been for, I guess, since college all the way down through. Paul would still probably be my favorite apostle. But when I read John, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, anything with John's name in the title, I can't help but feel challenged. John was known affectionately as the apostle of love. If you study John very much at all, you will find that John, of all of the apostles, of all of the New Testament writers, of all the people that we have read about in the Bible, John, from each of the 4 books that have his name, John is the apostle of love. Love permeates throughout every one of his the gospel, and then 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. John is the one that gives us the greatest challenge of all time when he said in John 13:35, "By this shall all men know that ye are my disciple." This is Jesus talking. Jesus said, and John's the only one that records it, "By this shall all men know that ye are my disciple." How many of you know the rest of that verse? 1. If you have love one for another. John said this is the only really true identifying mark that clearly identifies you is by your love one for another. He said, "By this shall all men know that you're my disciples, if you have love one to another." Now, I could stop right there and spend the rest of the evening looking at how we're to love one another. That's a sermon for another night. It was John the Apostle that said very bluntly and very plainly in 1 John 2:9, "He that saith he is in the light and hateth his brother is in darkness even until now." 1 John chapter 2 and verse 11, "He that hateth his brother is in darkness." No ifs, no ands, no buts, no exceptions, no unusual circumstances. If you have hatred, which includes, enmity, bitterness, all of those things, you are not saved. John his emphasis is so much on loving God and loving each other that he ventured to say, you are not saved if you don't have love one for another. He that hateth his brother is in darkness, and walketh in darkness, and knoweth not whither he goeth, because that darkness hath blinded his eyes. John was the disciple that Jesus loved. And we'll look at that in one of our points. But John is the apostle of love. Now, just quickly to refresh your memory, John gave up a lot. Humanly speaking, John gave up a lot in order to serve God. He came from a wealthy fishing family. We saw that in lesson 1. He gave up everything. When Jesus said, "Follow me," he immediately followed. No excuses. No, well, let me think about it. Let me pray about it. Jesus said, "Come." John immediately went. No arguing, no questioning, no debating, none of those things. Jesus said, "Come, follow me," and John immediately followed. We saw that in one of the earlier lessons. He left his wealth. He left his family. And I'll just throw this out. Sometimes family can be the biggest hindrance in people following God. And I don't say that to hate your family, although Jesus said, if any man come after me and hate not his father and his mother and his brother and his sister, even his spouse and his own life, if you're not willing to put God first, you cannot be my disciple. So John gave up his family, gave up his job, gave up a future that surely was a bright future. He gave up his house. He gave up oh boy, I just drew a total blank right there. He gave up the assurance of having a place to sleep at night. You know, as a fisherman, he had a house, he had a bedroom, had a bed, had a kitchen, had lots of food, and yet we know in following Jesus, there were times when Jesus said, the Son of Man hath not where to lay his head. So he followed Jesus, sleeping on the ground perhaps, eating what they could find that day. John also gave up a brother. We looked at James and John. When you get to the book of Acts, James, the brother of John, was the one that Herod killed. So by following Christ, by following Jesus, John and James put themselves in a position that was not popular with the world, and it cost James his life. And so John he lost his brother, and he went from there on, having lost his brother because they chose to follow Christ rather than stay with something that was certain. John was exiled to the Isle of Patmos. While he was exiled out on the island, God appeared unto him and showed him the future. And John wrote the book of Revelation while being stranded out on a deserted island. John did enjoy some special privileges. As I said last week, he was in the inner circle. I'm arguing. Do I want to? Don't. Yes, do. You know, I was taught from college pretty much on that as a pastor, you can't have special friends within the church. I had one pastor who was much older. We became very close. He told me one time, because, and I was at his church several times, he would preach, and then his office was just about where that dressing room is. He would preach, go to his office, and stay till almost everyone left, because he didn't want to show favoritism. And he told me one time, some members had invited us over to eat, and he said, oh, no. You never want to go out to eat with your members, because you don't want them to know you, and you don't want people thinking that you've got closer members than other members. And I swallowed that for a long time. And then I realized Jesus, the greatest example, the Son of God, who did no sin, who never did anything wrong, had a multitude of disciples. From those, he chose 12. From those 12, he chose 3. And from those 3, he chose 1. And that disciple became the disciple whom Jesus loved. John had a special place in the heart and mind of Jesus Christ. Some people are just easier to love. Me, if you can't love me, you can't love anybody. Sweet, adorable, wonderful, kind, thoughtful. And I gotta stop before she gets sick. Some people don't want you to know them. But I thought it was really significant that Jesus, the Son of God, who was perfect, never committed a sin, was closer to some of the apostles than he was others. And then, even within that, John was the only disciple, the only apostle that is said to be the apostle that Jesus loved. He loved others, but John was special. John was that innermost lining. It was John only that laid on the breast of Jesus at the Last Supper. And yet, for all of the privileges that he enjoyed, you will not find anywhere in any of John's writings, you won't find the slightest hint of pride. Even the other Gospels, who obviously John didn't want to toot his own horn much in the Gospel of John, but even the other writers, you don't see anything that gives a tiny hint that John let his special privilege, his special position, ever lift him up in pride. Brother Petrowski last night was mentioning that, and not that he did it, and I really did not realize. I knew him before he went to the mission field. I knew his wife before they even married, and I had no clue everything that he's gone through in the last several years there as a missionary. But he said, he said, it's easy. Now, you would have to know everything. He's still even now battling cancer. And they don't know what the long-term prognosis is going to be. But he said, it's easy. Even as a missionary pastor, God brought me through cancer. You know what? I'm special because God brought me through it. And it's like, I never looked at it that way. But pride can creep in anywhere. I have literally, and they called me the other night just to talk. I have this personal cell phone of a person who is in government very high up in Frankfurt. I'm on her. She's got my personal phone and called me the other night just to talk. I'm not going to tell you who she was. But it's like, wow, I am special. I've got the sheriff's number. I've got the major's cell phone. I got the captain's cell phone. I've got the other major's cell phone. Man, look at me. I'm special. of John's blessings, you don't see a tiny hint of pride. None. If anybody had a reason to be proud, it was John. But he wasn't. John was special because when Jesus was hanging on the cross, John chapter 19, he's hanging on the cross. He knows he's going to give up the ghost in just a few minutes. He knows that in just a few minutes, he's going to say his final words, "It is finished," and he's going to give up the ghost and go back to be with his Father. As he is hanging on the cross, John chapter 19, verse 26, when Jesus therefore, hanging from the cross, saw his mother and the disciple standing by, whom he loved, he saith unto his mother, "Woman, behold thy son." Then he saith to the disciple, "Behold thy mother." And from that hour, that disciple took her unto his own home. Jesus had many brothers and sisters. Why didn't he entrust the care of his mother to one of his brothers? There is a possible answer. But as he's facing death, and I think every one of us who love and respect our mother, and we know that we're going to die long before her, we would want to make sure that our mother was taken care of even as we die. And as he's facing death and he looks down and he sees his mother, who is the only person that he entrusts the care of his mother, John the Apostle. I don't entrust her to my brothers. I don't entrust her to Peter. I don't entrust her to any of the apostles. The only person, as I face death, the only person I will entrust my mother to is John the Apostle. Now, there's some facts about him that most people don't know. And even if you've read it, it probably didn't jump out at you. But I mentioned the other night, Jesus has risen from the grave. Mary and Mary and Mary have gone to the tomb. They ran back and said, "The tomb is empty." Peter and John take off running, go to the tomb. John, being the younger and the better athlete, John gets there first. I think many of us would have said, "Ooh, I'm going to take a peek before Peter gets here." John got there first. And out of respect for Peter, possibly because of age, John stepped back. And when Peter finally arrived, John stepped back and let Peter go in first. Not a big deal, but it gives us a glimpse to his humility and his preference. You know what? I got here first, but you're the elder. You should be the one to go in first. Remember when Jesus was arrested? He was taken to the judgment hall. The apostles had left him. Peter, who said, I will die with you. I will never leave you. I will die before I forsake you. Peter is outside, warming himself by the fire that was built by perhaps the Roman soldiers. There's an interesting verse in John chapter 18. John 18 and verse 15, and Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple, which was John the apostle. That disciple was known unto the high priest. John knew the high priest. He went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest. In verse 16, Peter stood at the door without. Then went out that other disciple, which was known unto the high priest, and spake unto her that kept the door, and brought in Peter. Several things there, and I'm not going to give every one of them. John was known by the high priest. That's pretty significant in and of itself. He went out and he simply told the girl at the gate, I'm John, I want to bring Peter in. And she immediately stepped back and let Peter go in. You didn't just walk in to the palace. You didn't just go up and say, well, I think I'm going to visit the palace, and open the door and walk through. You had to be known or specifically invited to get into the palace. John was very special. Remember, after Jesus rose, John chapter 21, they have not seen Jesus now in several days. And so Peter says, I'm going fishing. Well, a lot of the other apostles said, we'll go with you. And so Peter and many others went with him, and they toiled all night long and did not catch a single fish. The next morning the sun comes up, and down out on the shore they see a man having built a fire and was fixing breakfast. And of course we know it was Jesus. Jesus said, have you caught anything? And they said, not a thing. Cast your nets on the other side of the ship. They cast their nets on the other side of the ship. And they caught so many fish that it was more than they could handle. While they are reeling all of those in, John looks over, recognized Jesus, told Peter, that's Jesus on the shore. Out of all the apostles, John was the only one that recognized Jesus as being the one on the shore. It was John that recognized him, and then it was John who announced to the others. They still didn't get it. It was John that said, that is Jesus. He was special. I said he wrote the book of Revelation from the Isle of Patmos. And I know you've read this verse, but let me read it to you in light of what we already know. In Revelation chapter 10 and in verse 11, he, Jesus, said unto me, now John is stuck out on a deserted island all by himself out there. Jesus came and said, thou must prophesy again before many peoples and nations and tongues and kings. John, you're stranded out here on an island by yourself for doing nothing more than preaching. You were sent out here to die. You were sent out there all alone so that you could die out there and they wouldn't have to mess with you. But John, this isn't the end. You're going to get off of this island and you're going to preach again before many peoples, nationalities. You're going to preach to many nations, and you're going to speak with many tongues. And John, you are going to preach before kings. Even when John was exiled and left to die, Jesus said, I've still got something for you to do. You're going to preach to kings, plural. Now, quickly back to our text. And I've worked all the way up to get to this point. If you read the verses prior to where we read, you find out that Jesus has questioned the Apostle Peter. Remember, Peter had said, Lord, everybody else may desert you, but I will never desert you. I love you too much to ever desert you. And so Jesus says, Peter, do you really love me? And I'm not a big fan of Greek, but English is English. In the Greek, they have different words that are all translated as love. But the different words carry a different aspect of love. And so when Jesus looked at Peter, he said, do you love me with the same kind of love that God has? Peter has learned this lesson, and he used the word love, and it's translated love, but it's a different Greek word for love. So if we were to put it in without translating it, Peter said, Lord, you know I'm very fond of you. Jesus said, Peter, do you love me? As with God's love. Peter said, Lord, I'm very fond of you. Jesus looked at him the third time, and he used Peter's word for love. And he said, Peter, are you really fond of me? That's why Peter, got so upset, because now Jesus is asking him, and the translators translated it exactly as it was. But our word love has now taken on different meanings. It's not the translators, it's the English word love. Peter was grieved because Jesus said, "Are you even really fond of me?" Then in verse 20 and in verse 18, Jesus begins to tell Peter, "When you were young, you girded yourself, and you walked whither you would. But you're going to die. They're going to bind you. They're going to bind you. They're going to lead you, and they're going to take you out, and you're going to die as a martyr." And so Peter, just being told, you're going to die a martyr's death, he turns around and he sees John standing there. And like many of us, he said, "Lord, what about him?" Have you ever done that? "Okay, Lord. All right. But what are they going to do? What's he going to do? What's she going to do?" And Jesus gave the best answer that you could ever give. Basically, if it's my will that he lives till I return, that's none of your business. I hear it occasionally, so I know it still exists. "Well, I'm the only one that ever does anything. Why don't they do something?" They'll give an account to God for themselves. What they do is none of your business. He said, "If I will that he tarry till I come, what is that to thee? Follow me. Follow thou me." Don't worry about John. You take care of you. You follow me. And what I do with John is none of your business. You ever felt like Peter? "Lord, how come you're not doing anything?" Don't worry about her. She'll stand before God. She'll give an account to God. She's going to give an account for the deeds that she has done in this body. You follow me and don't worry about anybody or everybody else. You just follow me, and that's all. So then the rumors started flying. Did you hear what Jesus said? Jesus said John is never going to die. And John had to clarify it. That is not in verse 23. That is not what Jesus said. And John had to repeat what Jesus really had said. Sometimes the most faithful, dedicated, hardworking, spiritual-minded people you'll ever find will face false accusations. Jesus said he's never going to die. It's not what Jesus said. Let me clarify. That is not what Jesus said. But Peter, of all people, is the one that started this false rumor, and John had to stand up and say, that's not what Jesus said. Sometimes following Christ gets personal. Becomes very personal. People will question your motives. People will question what you say. People will question what you do. And sometimes it's your friends that question you. John said, that's not true. Can you imagine having to stand there in the presence of Christ and rebuke Peter and say, Peter, that is not what Jesus said? You know, the old adage is, just stay quiet, it'll blow away. Sometimes you have to stand. Sometimes you have to take those rumors and deal with them head on. Now, we could go into a lot of other things with John. We could look at some of the miracles he performed. We could read and study some of the lessons he taught. John recorded 7 miracles in the book of John, and he handpicked those miracles because each miracle portrayed a different aspect of God being the eternal Word. We could go into the 7 miracles. But I think you get the picture. I think of John as a man who was dearly beloved. A man who loved God, who loved his fellow men, a man with a servant's heart. And the only apostle, according to history, who died a natural death. He died of old age in a natural death. He died as he lived, loving and serving God. Now, I know I'm older than all but 2 of you. I know my years upon earth are not going to be doubled. I don't think I would want to. I know that I'm going to die. And I've often thought, and I've talked to my wife before about, and this, for some people, is not a big deal, but what do I want on my tombstone when I die? But even if my wife leaves it blank, she said, I can't think of anything to describe him. Low down, rotten, you know. So she leaves it blank. What will people think of me when I die? Boy, he was hard to get along with. He was stubborn. I hope that when I die, that my life has been such that people could say honestly and truly that I tried to the best of my ability to show the light of Christ to those around me. I hope that people could say that my life was not lived in vain. I would like to think, even if they have to fudge a little bit, that people could say He died a servant of God. I'm going to die, but so are you. And you're going to leave a testimony behind you. Now, I know at funerals, everybody's a saint when they're in the casket. But what will people remember you? How will you go down in history? What will people say about you that really know the real you? Not the Sunday morning you, but the real you. John, we can look at John and say he died serving God. He died preaching. He died preaching to peoples and nations and different languages. He died serving God. Could people honestly and truly say that about you? Now, everybody's going to say, oh, they were such nice people. I've learned that doesn't mean squat. What will people say about you when you die?